Hello there. This video is part of a series on taking better pictures of people, perfect portraits if you will. And in the last video we talked about things that your subject can do that will help improve the outcome of your portrait session. And in this video I want to focus very much on things that you as a photographer can do that will help you get a better picture. So in this video, some of the time I can illustrate the concepts I'm talking about using a shoot with Lisa, a professional model, although some of the time you'll just have to take my word for it. Now before you start the shoot, I'd highly recommend making sure you are familiar and comfortable with all your equipment, whether that's cameras, lights, tripods, whatever it may be. You don't want to break the flow of your shoot by having to fiddle around with stuff, a setting you weren't familiar with, trying to work out how a light functions, any of those things, because that will break that flow of your work, that will break your concentration, it will break the rapport with the subject. Now it's quite possible if you're working with somebody professional in front of the camera, whether that's a model or whoever it may be, they'll be quite tolerant of you having to take a little break and muck around, and you may even be able to set an entire shoot up whereby all you're doing really is practicing and testing with your equipment with a professional model. But even so, you'll still break that flow, and if you're working with people in front of the camera who are not comfortable in front of the camera, you're going to make them feel even less comfortable if you're spending lots and lots of time fiddling with your equipment, mucking about, and like I say, breaking that flow and that connection. Now when you start the shoot, whether you've never met the person before or you know them very, very well, first things first, establish a good rapport with them. Be polite, be welcoming, offer them drinks, food, whatever it might be. Essentially treat them like an honoured guest and make sure they feel special. Make sure that they feel that they are the sole focus of your attention. This is also the time when you should be showing them images that you've researched about the sort of work you want to create together. Okay, you may already have done this via email or WhatsApp or whatever, but this is the time where you can sit with them and say, right, this is the sort of look I'm going for, I want this kind of thing. It's also the time to brief them on any technical details they might need to know if you're doing a particularly elaborate setup or there's anything they might need to know about health and safety. Get all of that out of the way, get that rapport established, and make sure you're starting to build a good connection with them. Now, things not to do obviously include just being plain rude. I mean, that should be obvious. But also try and avoid controversial topics of conversation, particularly with people you don't know. It's just not worth risking. If you've only got a limited window of time with somebody, and I frequently have this photographing celebrities, I might have minutes with someone, it's not the time to launch into a controversial topic because for all you know, you could really get their backs up, and rather than having somebody you can work with, you've got somebody who is now antagonistic towards you. Also, things not to do include being too close to people. Be very conscious of people's personal space. It's extremely unprofessional to go in and start touching people that you're photographing. It really is. And of course, any degree of nudity, be very careful, and anybody who is in any way vulnerable, such as children, tread extremely carefully. Always remember, be professional, be polite, and respect people's personal space. So now we come to the real crux of taking a great portrait, something that I've trailed several times in previous videos, and that is directing your subject, trying to get a certain performance out of them. Developing and refining this skill is what will take your portraits from being perfectly okay, great technical exercises, nicely shot, nicely composed, sharp, etc., into being something great, into having that extra element to them that makes them stand out beyond just simple technical exercise. And this all comes down to directing. It comes down to how you communicate with your subject and getting a performance out of them that is in tune with what you want to create in your portrait. The key concept to take on board here is thinking of yourself as a director, as you would a feature film director. Now, you may not be totally down with the exact job description of a director in a feature film, but essentially they're in charge of the entire creative side of the film. The producer deals with the organisation and all those sort of things, but the director is in charge of the overall look and finish of the film. But when they're actually shooting, what the director is really concerned with is the performance of the actors in front of the camera. They'll be the ones who will insist, no, I didn't like that, let's do another take, can you do it with greater emotion, can you give me more pain, more suffering, whatever the approach might be. They'll also know when to back off and let the actors in front of the camera do their thing and just go with the flow. But they will have in their mind a very clear idea of how they want the actors to perform on camera and what they want the final film to look, feel and sound like based around those performances. You need to harness that skill as a photographer if you want to take great portraits. So, how do we do this? Well, let's start with some very simple nuts and bolts. One of the simplest things is to think about your language and the words you use to communicate with your subject. Above all, make sure to use positive language. Try and reinforce positive things rather than drawing attention to negative things. If there is something negative, try and find a positive way of phrasing it. For example, if somebody is sitting in a certain way that doesn't flatter them, it gives them a double chin or it emphasises, some weight around their middle, don't say, oh, sit back, you're getting a double chin, or sit more upright, you're looking fat, because the minute you mention that word, the minute you put a negative thought in their head, they are going to focus on it. Instead, turn that round, get them to do the same thing, but phrase it in a positive way. So say something like, can you sit a bit more upright for me? I want you to give me a bit more of an imposing feel. I want you to be taller on camera. Or can you just lift your chin up slightly? I want you to look down at me and be a bit more domineering. Okay, find a positive way of saying it rather than anything negative, because people will lock onto that negative. And try not to draw attention to things that people are probably sensitive of. So if people do have, obvious double chins or bald spots or whatever it may be, don't keep drawing attention to it, because you will damage their confidence, and that's never going to help. Now, when we're talking about actual specific direction, precise instructions you're giving to your subject, such as where to stand, where to look, how to move, be concise and be clear. Don't use vague, open-ended terms. I always try and ensure, for example, that when I give somebody left or right directions, I'm referring to their left or right rather than mine. People still will get confused, because people often get confused about left and right, but also they think that I'm doing it from my point of view. But do it from their point of view so they know which way they should be turning. Also, you'll usually find that the movements people need to make are quite small and subtle, and you may need to reinforce this. It's quite rare for somebody to need to take huge, great steps. They'll probably disappear out of frame. I can't tell you how many times I've said to somebody, just twist around a couple of degrees for me, and they've turned almost all the way around. No help at all. So make it clear to people that you're probably talking about quite small, subtle movements. Don't be afraid to help people out with that. For example, if you want somebody's head to be facing a certain way, give them an exact point to look at, or if need to be, hold your hand a certain angle away from the camera so that people will look in the precise direction you want. Be careful what they're looking at, because of course if they make eye contact with somebody else they may lose concentration, but it can certainly help to have them pick a spot if that's what you need for the shot and just look at that rather than stare straight down the camera like a rabbit in headlights. So let's talk about performance, this act that your subject is going to put on in front of your camera to help you create this great portrait. Now, performance might sound like a very grand term. You might be thinking of something very flamboyant and over the top. But of course, in pretty much all cases, when you're taking somebody's portrait, so as we discussed several videos ago, a portrait is where you're both collaborating, the subject is aware they're being photographed, there will always be some element of performance, even if you're trying to make something very naturalistic and very relaxed, because the subject will know they're being photographed. It's almost impossible to make things completely natural and unforced, because they're aware they're being watched. So there will always be some degree of performance, even if we're not talking about a huge, flamboyant, over-the-top, great big showpiece. Now, before you've started taking this portrait, you've hopefully thought through your ideas, you've done a bit of research, you know what it is you're trying to get across in this shot, and that, of course, is the essence of the performance. That's what role you want your subject to play. So communicate this to them clearly. Try and avoid using vague language, be as specific as you can. People generally will struggle if you tell them, oh, just be yourself. Because they'll think, well, which part of me? Do I need to be projecting confidence? Do I need to look quite neutral? Do I need to be looking happy? Do I need to be, well, what do you mean, be myself? It doesn't help. If you give someone a specific role to play, they're almost certain to give you a better performance in front of camera. No doubt about it. And I can't guarantee that every single subject will instantly become an Oscar-worthy actor. But if you say to somebody, right, I want you to look serious and businesslike, rather than just, oh, just sit there, you'll get something better out of them. If you say to them, I want you to feel as if you've just run a marathon, you're absolutely exhausted and spent, you'll get a better result than just saying, oh, just be yourself. Okay, so get this across to somebody, drill down to what the essence of the performance is, and then direct them accordingly. Give them a role to play. Now, the reason this tends to work is that it makes people less self-conscious. If people are playing a role, they are aware they are acting up. They are not necessarily being themselves. You're not judging them to the same degree, and it helps people lose that conscious air that we talked about in the previous video, whereby you're trying to be self-conscious and self-aware in terms of how you sit and stand and move, but also unself-conscious so that you don't get too caught up and too tense and just relax into the performance. The better an idea they've got of what that performance needs to be, the less self-conscious they'll become, the more they'll relax into the role, and the better performance you'll get out of them. Now, saying all this, I can appreciate that some people watching might think this all sounds really strict and prescribed and limiting. Why can't people just be themselves and muck about in front of camera? Well, the truth is, giving yourself this structure and these parameters will allow you to then do that, and that's often where the magic happens. By far, some of the best work I've ever done is whereby I've worked to create the structure, to get the right location, to get the lighting right, to bring in other personnel, hair and makeup artists, stylists, whatever it may be. And I've communicated everything very clearly to my subject, and we've built this structure, we've built this sort of environment, almost like the set of a play in the theatre. And then within that, they've got a clear idea of what role they're supposed to be playing, and I've got all the pieces in place, and then you play around, then you get to go with the flow. So there is actually much more freedom to it than you might imagine. You're not really constricting people, you're simply giving them the building blocks to let them go and play with things. And people who are very good on camera will really, really respond to that. They'll know what they're supposed to be doing, and you'll create some absolutely magical images. One of the ways to help this along is not to take things too seriously. I've talked about being specific in communication, but that doesn't mean you have to be serious in your communication. You can be quite relaxed. You can start the shoot almost mucking about. I've often gone into the set myself, stood where the subject will stand and taught them through things and played around a little bit and said, look, you've got light here, you've got a prop here you can work with, you could do this with your costume, your clothing, whatever you're wearing, and taught them through things and helped them to get into the swing of things. Don't be too tight and too strict. Don't be afraid to muck about. Okay. Ultimately, we're trying to take pretty pictures. It's not brain surgery. It's not rocket science. It's not too serious. So don't take yourself too seriously. Working like this also helps reinforce the idea that it's a collaboration between you and the subject. It's not just you telling them what to do. It's like, stand there, do this, which will put a lot of people off, of course. Ultimately, you're all about that collaboration. That's where the great shots are. So put the time in before the shoot and on the day itself to create this structure, to get the technical side right, to have your ideas clearly worked out, to have the personnel you might need, the location you might need. And then when you've got all the pieces together, let yourself play. So let's take a couple of minutes to actually talk about talking, because it's quite important. I'm a huge fan of talking from behind the camera. I do love the sound of my own voice. I can keep up almost an Austin Powers level of inane chatter from behind the camera, all of which is positive and reinforcing, and I'm not taking myself very seriously. Generally, I find it really helps to relax the subject. However, there's a couple of things to bear in mind about what you're talking and what you're talking about from behind the camera. As I stressed earlier, always be positive, don't use neutral language. It's great to engage in a conversation with your subject, but perhaps not when you're actually shooting. Time might be very tight during that little window when you've actually got the camera to your eye and you're taking the pictures. So it's perhaps not the time to stop and have an actual chat, because you may only have a few minutes. Certainly lots of the celebrity work I've done, time is very, very tight, and it's lovely to have a little chat beforehand, maybe afterwards, but during the actual shoot, it's kind of one way. I tend to be talking, directing, chatting away, rather than stopping and asking them questions. Now, you want to ask them questions to begin with, get to know them, establish a rapport and things, and express your interest in them. But don't forget, very, very few people actually look good on camera mid-conversation, as these film stills will tell you. People's mouths and faces move in some very strange shapes, so if you're trying to catch still images whilst people are talking, you may not get very good results, certainly not very flattering results. Now, something really tricky is making people laugh on demand. And I cannot tell you the secret of that, because of course humour is incredibly subjective. What makes one person laugh won't work for somebody else, and of course you should be very, very careful about telling jokes, particularly ones that might be controversial, because you could lose somebody completely. If for some reason you do need to have laughter in your shot, if that's your brief or that's what you're trying to create, then all I would suggest, the best thing you could do is everything I've said up to this point about making them comfortable, making your subject feel like they're part of the process, and just having a relaxed and easygoing atmosphere on set. All of that will help. I can't guarantee you laughter if you do that, but it'll certainly be more helpful than having a very strict authoritarian system, or a subject who's freezing cold or starving hungry. You know, all of those facets will help to make them relaxed and comfortable, and therefore more likely to laugh. What is quite likely though is that you want your subject to smile, or at least appear to be happy and pleased. The greatest trick I was taught about this, I think I was taught it when I was assisting some 20 plus years ago with a fashion photographer, is to do what's called smizing rather than smiling. Now, you've probably heard this, I think it's been on top model TV programs a few times. Smizing is smiling with your eyes rather than just your mouth. It sounds like a gimmick, but it does actually work. If I sit and look to camera now and I just smile with my mouth, it looks a bit forced and artificial. Okay, particularly if I start getting really cheesy and teethy. If instead I smile with my eyes, it looks a degree more authentic. I just had quite a bit of coffee, so I'm quite shaky. That won't be the best example, but the best way I can describe to direct people to do this is to actually get them to think about the muscles around their eyes, where you get crow's feet, where you get wrinkle lines, laughter lines from laughing. If they focus on those muscles instead and think about activating those rather than just the muscles around here, they'll create a more natural looking smile. Now again, if you want a smile just like laughter, you'll be in a much better position if you've done all the other things right, if they're relaxed and comfortable, ba-bum, ba-bum, bum. But that little tip of thinking about smiling around here rather than around here will be hugely helpful. So the polar opposite to laughter and smiles is somebody who is nervous, anxious and tense. Now, you are going to come across people like this almost certainly. Mainly it'll be people who are not used to being in front of camera because of course the situation is very unfamiliar to them. Professional models, celebrities, etc., less likely to get nervous and tense, but it can still happen. The best way to get around it is, as I keep stressing, all of that basic environmental stuff. You know, be confident with what you're doing, have everything running nice and smoothly, have a relaxed atmosphere on set, make sure they are comfortable, warm, fed, whatever it may need to be, because that alone will help remove some of the tension and some of the anxiety. If you happen to be shooting with quite a crowded set, for example, I mean, this happened to me quite a bit, it might help to clear the set as much as possible. It may even be that you just need to get down to just you and the subject, or you might have to have somebody else on set, such as a makeup artist who might need to dive in. But if you sense that they're getting a bit anxious around a crowd, clear the room as much as you can. The other thing that can help a lot is something I mentioned earlier, which is kind of working with them and stepping into the set yourself. If they're nervous and anxious about what they're doing, it can really help if you step in and walk them through it and demonstrate yourself and say, yeah, this is what I'm after. You know, sit this way, look this way, go through these sort of motions. It also helps hugely, I find, if you're working on a tripod and basically taking the camera away from your face. If somebody is nervous or tense and there's this great big black thing staring them in the face and it's hiding you and hiding your contact with them, it will make them more nervous. Instead, leave the camera on a tripod and step away from it, or if you've got it around your neck, hold it down here. Take little pauses, keep re-establishing that contact, that eye contact and that rapport, and it'll definitely help to calm them down. This is also a good time to talk about when you should and when you shouldn't show your subject the images on the back of the camera. I would generally recommend you don't show anybody anything on the back of the camera until you're happy with what you've got, because even professional models and celebrities might understand that, oh, I haven't got the lighting right just yet, but they still won't want to see something that doesn't make them look good. And this certainly applies for people who are not used to being on front of camera. If they see an image that makes them look bad, or the lighting is all over the place, or whatever it may be, they're not going to understand that this is a work in progress. Okay, so keep shooting, then when you've got something that works, that's when you can show them, and you use it just like you did with the language we talked about a few minutes ago. Use it as positive reinforcement. You show them an image and say, look, this looks fantastic, this is just what I'm after. If you can give me a couple more like that, but maybe a bit more energy, maybe 5% more energy, that will help much more than stopping all the time and looking, breaking that rapport and showing them stuff that makes them look bad and makes them even more anxious. So Those are some very, very crucial things that will help you direct your subject better and get the right performance out of them, which in turn should make for much better portraits. Now, one last little tip, something I was taught, again, back in my assisting days, some 20 plus years ago, and that's the simple rule that there can only be one ego on set. And that ego should be the person in front of the camera. Not you, not the art director, not the makeup artist, not your assistant, whoever it may be. The most important person is that person in front of the camera. For that brief window when you're photographing them, they should be the center of attention, they should have all your attention focused on them, and theirs is the only ego allowed on set. Okay, remember that, remember to communicate clearly, establish a good rapport with them, make them feel comfortable, make them feel wanted, and make them feel that you're interested in them, and you will have a much, much better chance of getting a great portrait out of the shoot. Okay, that's all for this video. The next video is going to cover posing, how to sit, stand, move to make a human body look better than it normally does. It's YouTube, you know what to do, click like, subscribe, hit this, that and the other. If you've got any questions, stick them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. I'll see you soon.